Shalom, friends. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to start in just one moment. We're just going to set up the live stream to go live here, and we know others are trickling in still, but we are very much looking forward to this session on the topic Zionism without idolatry, power is not to be worshipped. And we're here with one of our regular inspiring educators, Rabbi Zachary Truboff, who is the director of the International Beit Din Institute for Aguna Research and Education, a think tank founded by the IBD to address the halachic dimensions of the Aguna problem. As part of his work, he is writing a guide to Jewish divorce, which will focus on the problems and the possibilities of the contemporary Beit Din system. He's also the author of Torah Goes Forth from Zion, essays on the thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shigar, and his writings on Jewish thought and Zionism have appeared in a variety of publications. Before making Aliyah, he served for nearly a decade as the rabbi of Cedar Sinai Synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio. Currently, he lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Jen, and their 4 children. For more of his writing and shiurim, see zachtruboff.com. I will also put that into the chat over there. Rabbi Truboff is someone that I have known for almost 20 years as someone who is deeply Torah-rooted and unafraid to speak what he understands to be truth. And that is very rare in the world for people to not be concerned with speaking truth to power and saying what needs to be said. And he's helping us develop a new, if you can mute yourself, please, over there. It'd be great if you can mute yourself. Thank you. Isaac, if you can mute everyone.
I'll put this in your work drawer over there.
Michael, if you're able to mute yourself. Thank you so much. Rabbi Truboff is helping us provide a religious language and a Jewishly rooted language for how to think through these related questions to Zionism without idolatry. Okay, Rabbi Truboff, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Rav Shmuel. It's always an honor to teach with Orlid Tzedek. I mean, I remember teaching for Orlid Tzedek, I think almost 20 years ago. That's kind of incredible. And it provides a unique space to address issues in ways that just can't be done elsewhere. So I'm greatly appreciative for that. The topic we're going to be looking at over the next hour or so is, I have to admit, it's not an easy topic. It's not an easy topic because on some level it addresses the great pain and difficulty that the Jewish people and the state of Israel has experienced over the last year or so. And of course, I think anybody who watches the news recognizes that the pain and suffering of this conflict the last year is not limited to the Jews, right? There are a whole host of peoples, the Palestinians, those in Lebanon, other places who are suffering as well. Part of what makes any kind of conversation about this so difficult, and again, I fully recognize how difficult it is because for Jews in Israel, for Israelis, there's a sense that this war is a fight for our lives. It's a war of self-defense, it's an existential war, and it has to be won against an implacable enemy. And when you're in a war, an existential war, right, there's really no room for criticism. It's just not the way it works. And on the other side of the ocean, in America, right, there's sort of a different problem. Obviously, American Jews are not directly under threat in the way that Israelis are, but American Jews have experienced an explosion in anti-Semitism, and particularly, I would say, a very strident and even virulent forms of anti-Zionism that has been rather shocking, something that people have never really seen in their lifetimes. And in an environment when people are unfairly attacking you and your enemies appear there out to get you, again, the very notion of critique just seems out of place. Right? It just seems like you're helping those that want to undermine us or destroy us. I'm trying to sort of walk between that in a sense, I've been a lifelong Zionist. I made Aliyah with my family 6 years ago. In many ways, my life has been shaped by Zionism almost in its entirety. And I think, like a lot of Jews and a lot of Israelis, I was particularly shaken by the events of October 7th and the war that has followed. Immediately after October 7th, one of the things I really tried to be cognizant of is that in the Jewish tradition, there is a sense about how we're supposed to respond to crisis and catastrophe. And it's not so easy. What the Jewish tradition often outlines is that in times of crisis, in times of catastrophe, right, the challenge is not to blame the other, right? It's not to find a scapegoat who's really responsible for suffering, right? The challenge is always to look inward, right? As it says in the Gemara Brachot, right? If suffering comes upon a person, right, they must search their actions, right? We have to look inward. We have to take responsibility. And it's the hardest thing to do, because when you are suffering, when there's somebody who you perhaps can point to who is responsible for it, the very idea that you should take responsibility, that you should use it as an opportunity to rethink things, is often too much for us. But crisis and catastrophe are meant to be catalysts on some level for tshuva in the Jewish tradition. They're meant to be catalysts for rethinking our actions, and perhaps even more importantly, rethinking our beliefs and our commitments. It requires it. Because if in the moments when our world starts collapsing around us, if in that moment we're not willing to question things, is there ever going to be a moment where we're willing to do so? Right? That's always the challenge. So that was the position that I was coming from in approaching this. And I think, like a lot of people, right, just seeing again sort of the bloodshed of the war, the attitudes towards the war on all sides, has exposed me to things that are, again, hard to grasp. Right? I lived in America for many years. I was there for September 11th. I remember how horrifying and shocking that was. And that was in many ways felt very similar to October 7th. I remember the explosion of patriotism in America after September 11th. I remember feeling so clearly America was on the side of good, right? Al-Qaeda, the terrorists, they were on the side of evil. And it was very clear what we needed to do. But as the years passed, what I came to realize, I think a lot of Americans came to realize, is that sort of moral clarity that one thinks they have in the wake of crisis or catastrophe tends in hindsight to be proven perhaps a bit more complicated. And that's exactly what I want to do, is try to assess like what makes it so complicated. To do this, we're going to be looking at many of the writings of Rav Moshe Amiel, a very well-known religious Zionist rabbi, thinker, leader in his day, but someone to a certain extent who's become forgotten in the passing decades. Rav Amiel is important because he is probably the only religious Zionist that I know, and I've spent a lot of time studying religious Zionists, who is able to affirm Zionism while bringing a profound religious critique to it, a comprehensive religious critique to it. Or you might be familiar with thinkers like Yeshaya Leibovitz, who in some ways offers similar thought to Rav Amiel, but Rav Amiel is in some ways much more comprehensive in the scope that he's trying to grasp when it comes to Zionism, its possibilities and its dangers. And he's living at a time before the state, for the most part, when Zionism has yet to become concretized into what we know it is today, which means it's still a dynamic force, right? It's still yet to be determined what Zionism is going to be. And to a certain extent, I still hope that is true today, that Zionism is yet to be determined fully what it's going to be. And that gives his thought, again, a dynamism that is important when we're reflecting on this kind of topic. Let me just pull up the source sheet real quick. So before we jump into Rav Amiel, I wanted to give sort of as a preface to this from actually a different thinker, and that is from Rav Aaron Tamarat, who is in many ways a contemporary of Rav Amiel. Both him and Rav Amiel, they basically are educated in Lithuanian yeshivot. That is the community they are from, known for its intellectualism, both in Torah and beyond Torah. What is interesting about Rav Tamarat is that Rav Tamarat was a Zionist, and then after a period of time, decided to separate himself from the Zionist movement, decided to leave the Zionist movement, in many ways because he became disillusioned with it, with what he saw as its challenges and sort of where he saw it going. The reason I want to start with—
Excuse me, can I interrupt? Can you put these sources in the chat, or can we get them?
I don't have an easy way to give it to you right now, but I'm happy to get it to Rav Shmuley if he can send them out to everybody.
Please do that. Okay, thank you.
Rav Tamarat, as I said, was a Zionist, religious Zionist, and then ultimately leaves the movement because of his disillusionment. And in one of his letters, not a letter, but it's very, very interesting, in part because who he writes it to. He writes it to Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, right, the son of Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. Rav Kook, the father, is in many ways the founder of religious Zionism as we know it today. Rav Tzvi Yehuda is the son, and Rav Tzvi Yehuda is in many ways the primary figure responsible for shaping the course of religious Zionism during the Six-Day War and afterwards, right? Gush Emunim, the settlement enterprise, are very much part of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook's legacy. Rav Tamarat had a relationship with Rav Kook, the father. They have letters back and forth between them. But this particular letter to Rav Tzvi Yehuda is so important because of Rav Tamarat says something that we should all know, but have a hard time trying to grasp. And he had sent Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook one of his own books, and he sends a letter to Rav Tzvi Yehuda, and here's how he frames what his own project is, which he knows stands to a certain extent in opposition to Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook. Rav Tamarat writes this letter after he's essentially left Zionism. He says, the central idea of my book is to uproot idolatry regarding sovereignty and the state. Right? Rav Tamarat is a critic of nationalism, in large part because he's seen what it does in late 19th century, early 20th century Europe. Right? Nationalism is probably the most important historical force outside of Marxism in the late 19th and early 20th century. And he knows what it can do. He knows what nationalism can do. He knows what the nation state can be, for better or for worse. And he sees an inherent and intrinsic connection between nationalism and idolatry. Now, this position is actually not that strange, he goes on to note. He says, this task, the task of his book, draws directly in the most straightforward sense from the Bible, from the Tanakh. He says, basically, if you want to know why I have a problem with nationalism and also to a certain extent a problem with Zionism, and that I see these idolatrous tendencies within it, he says, that's because I've read the Tanakh. Right? One of the striking things he kind of notes here is that Zionism is famous for its return to the Bible. Right? This is something particularly among secular Zionists, but even religious Zionists as well. Right? There's a return to the Bible representing this living connection to the land of Israel, Jewish life in the land of Israel. Right? Jews return to the land, they return to the Bible. Right? Jews historically had studied Talmud, they studied the oral Torah, they didn't study the written Torah as its own text for the most part. Zionism on some level seeks to return to the Bible itself. But what Rav Tamarat notes is that it seems that most Zionists have not read the Bible, have not read the Tanakh all the way through. What do I mean by this? He says, as is the principle, uprooting idolatry requires one to seek after its roots. Right? If you want to uproot idolatry, you have to go down into the causes of it. He says, I found it essential to show that in our Bible and Talmud, kings are despised and the heroes of the Bible are not the kings, but the prophets. Right? If you read the whole Bible, what you quickly discover when you get to Nevi'im and to Ketuvim is that the Jewish entrance to the land of Israel, the Jewish conquering of the land of Israel, the establishment of Jewish sovereignty, it goes hand in hand with idolatry. Right? This is something one sees again and again and again. If you have a king, if you have sovereignty in the land, right, there is a primary concern that is going to turn towards idolatry. And when you read Nevi'im, right, the kings are not really so much the heroes, right? The only king, or the only two kings you can perhaps call the heroes of Tanakh are King David and his son, King Solomon. Everybody else doesn't just have sins, but has major, major, major sins. And again, many of those sins are often deeply tied up with the establishment of idolatry, with turning the Jewish people away from God, right, again and again and again. And Rav Tamarat says, he says, the essence of the words, his words, are directed at Zionism, which has turned the Bible into the foundation of its national political aspirations. Zionism has returned to the Bible, but as I said, it's like they didn't read all the way through. Because you read all the way through, Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel is a very, very messy endeavor, and it usually goes wrong, and it usually goes wrong idolatry is often at the heart of it. So we're going to unpack where this idea comes from. Nationalism is idolatry, the potential for Zionism to become idolatry, particularly in the writings of Rav Amiel. But what I want to note here, something interesting, is that Rav Tabarat and Rav Amiel both are willing to conceive of the idea that Zionism might be a form of idolatry. What's interesting is that most ultra-Orthodox opponents of Zionism did not view Zionism in those terms. Right? We might think that if you're ultra-Orthodox, if you're Haredi, if you oppose Zionism, right, what better way to denigrate it than to call it idolatry, the worst sin a Jew can do, right? But most Haredi opponents did not refer to Zionism as idolatry. They referred to it as kfirah. They referred to it as heresy. In fact, there's a very interesting tshuva responsa by the Mishnah Halachot, Rabbi Menashe Klein, Hungarian ultra-Orthodox, very anti-Zionist rabbi in Brooklyn, born in Europe, but spent a lot of his life in Brooklyn. He's asked the question of whether or not a Jew can daven in a synagogue with an Israeli flag, right? And if there's anybody you would think that would get up and say, guess what, right? You can't daven in a shul with an Israeli flag because that flag is a symbol of idolatry, right? It would be him. That's what you would think. In fact, he even notes there are a very small number of rabbis who might even think such things. But despite his own anti-Zionist leanings, which are very, very strong, Hungarians anti-Zionists are the strongest anti-Zionists, he says, you know what? Zionism is not idolatry. And how do I know this, he says? Because they're all heretics. They don't believe in God. And if they don't believe in God, if they're fully secular, they're atheists, they certainly can't be considered idol worshippers. That is the traditional Haredi approach to Zionism. What I find interesting is that both Rav Tabarat and Rav Amiel, who were essentially insiders to Zionism, they have a bit of a different approach. And perhaps from the inside, they're able to see things that those from the outside cannot. Without further ado, we'll now move into Rav Amiel's writings here. And again, there's a lot of text you're going to see on these screens. I'm going to do my best not to read most of it, but to read the key parts and to summarize it. What I want to note here is, again, sort of lay out Rav Amiel's understanding of Zionism, particularly the potential dangers in it. And in this particular essay, which he gives he writes, it's actually from a speech he gives at a Mizrahi conference in the mid-30s in Europe. He himself, Rav Amiel, makes Aliyah in 1935 and becomes the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. He dies in 1946. Just to give you a sense of Rav Amiel's own greatness, when he was a candidate to be the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, the two other candidates were people who had a claim to be the two greatest rabbis of the 20th century. One was Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. At the time, he was a young man, but he was still one of the candidates. And the other was Rav Herzog, who later becomes the chief rabbi of Israel and a very, very important figure. Rav Amiel is chosen over both of them, right? And his greatness, both in areas of Talmudic, halachic, and Jewish philosophy, is really incredible and often unappreciated. This particular essay, he's laying out his understanding of Zionism. And he notes something very, very important. First off, unlike what you hear today, Rav Amiel is very careful to note that even though he's a religious Zionist, perhaps the leading religious Zionist thinker in Mizrahi, the party of religious Zionism, he is very careful to note that one should not conflate Judaism and Zionism as being the same thing. Now, today, this kind of sounds heretical to a lot of Jews, right? Because today, right, to be a good Jew means being a good Zionist, right? To being a good Jew means supporting Israel. It's just sort of taken for granted. Zionism, the state of Israel, it is the natural endpoint of Judaism, right? The two go hand in hand. Rav Amiel is trying to get us to remember that there are contradictions between Zionism and Judaism. They are not one and the same. And that is what he wants to try to lay out here for us. He notes that when it comes to the Rambam's 13 principles of faith, right, one can essentially make them work with Zionism, right? So you can argue the essential principles of Judaism, they do kind of work with Zionism. In fact, the only principle of faith that might be a problem with Zionism is the one that states that we have to believe with complete faith in the coming of the Messiah, right? And that principle might be in tension with Zionism because Zionism seemingly asserts we don't have to wait for the Mashiach, right? We can go to the land of Israel, and for many religious Zionists, we can help unfold the process of redemption, right? But Rav Amiel goes on to argue, you know what, even that is not so much of a problem. That's not really the contradiction between Judaism and Zionism. The fundamental contradiction between Judaism and Zionism, he says, is as follows. He says, historically, when Jews reflected on what Judaism was, he says it was best distilled in a principle of Rav Sa'adja Gaon, a great rabbi, a Gaonic figure, 10th, 11th, 10th century, who said as follows: Ein umotenu uma ela b'torata. Right? Our nation is only a nation because of the Torah. Right? And what Rav Sa'adja Gaon is getting at, and Rav Amiel thinks is so important, is that if you imagine, right, the Jewish people, right, to be essentially lined up in a circle, right? We'll think for a moment, right? Simchas Torah was just a week ago, right? On Simchas Torah, you spend your life, spend the day, right, dancing in a circle, right? Much of Jewish life, you could argue, is this experience of sort of moving in a circle, right? The Shabbat comes every week. The holidays come every year, right? You keep returning to the same parshas again and again and again, right? Jewish life has a cyclical dimension to it, right? According to Sa'adja Gaon, and according to most of Judaism for the last 2,000 years, if the Jews are moving in a circle, it is the Torah that's in the center, right? And that shouldn't surprise us, right? Because on Simchas Torah, when we're dancing in a circle, what's in the center, right? The center is the Torah, right? And essentially what that means is that Jewish life is oriented around Torah being at the center, and ultimately Torah as an embodiment of God's will, God being at the center, of course, as well, right? What we have to keep in mind, right, is that that is what has oriented Jewish life. Torah comes first. God comes first. What changes with the 19th century and with the emergence of Zionism is what Rav Amiel calls here a Copernican revolution, right? Before Copernicus, right, people thought the sun revolved around the earth, right? After Copernicus, they realized that the earth revolves around the sun. We live in a heliocentric solar system. A total transformation. That is what happens with modernity, and that's the kind of transformation that Zionism itself proposes. And what he says here is, he says Zionism has brought a Copernican revolution in the Jewish world. What this means is that previously God and Torah were at the center of all things, just like on Simchas Torah. And we, the Jewish people, and even more so the land of Israel, revolved around them like dancing in a circle. Through Zionism, the opposite is now true. The land of Israel, and more importantly, the Jewish people, has been made the center of all centers, and Torah and God have been made peripheral, right? If we want to sort of play out the metaphor here, if traditionally on Simchas Torah, Jews danced in a circle and the Torah was at the center, what Zionism proposes is that the Jewish people are at the center, and God and the Torah revolve around them. Jewish people in the land of Israel at the center, God and the Torah revolve around them. What nationalism does is fundamentally a secular enterprise, is it puts the nation first. It puts the nation at the center. The nation is what matters most. The nation is the source of our values, our culture, right? Everything comes from the nation. Everything ultimately returns to the nation, right? The nation is the highest value of all. As I said, the Jewish people are now at the center. Now, part of the reason we should find this a bit disconcerting, well, there are many reasons why, obviously, but one of them I want to note here, because Rav Amiel hints to it in the Hebrew. He actually cites a verse from Shir HaShirim, Kibemacholot HaMachanayim Mesaviv LaMerkaz, right? This notion of mecholot, which is circle dancing, right? There is one other place in Chumash in which circle dancing, maybe more than one, but one particular one that appears in Chumash that is of great significance to this whole conversation. When Moshe comes down from Har Sinai with the first Luchot, he discovers that the Jewish people are engaging in idolatry. He hears some noise. Him and Yoshua end up going down right after Moshe argues with God. What does Moshe see? The Torah is very clear. He sees the Jewish people dancing in a circle around the golden calf. Right? God isn't at the center anymore, right? The golden calf is at the center. So when we have this radical transformation with Zionism, when Jewish people are put at the center, what that means, instead of the Jewish people being bound in a covenant in which they are compelled by the Torah, by God, by the other, by putting themselves at the center, God and Torah potentially exist only to serve the Jewish people. Right? They don't exist to put a check on the Jewish people. They don't exist to compel or command the Jewish people. They exist ultimately to serve the Jewish people. That is the potential dynamic that one runs into when one, again, puts the nation at the center. And I want to be very clear, Zionism as a secular nationalist movement, right, puts the Jewish people at the center. That is the way that it conceives of things. I want to give another example of just sort of the problematic nature of this, but just how basic it is. Hannah Arendt, no great lover of Zionism, famous German Jewish philosopher. In one of her essays, she has a note in which she describes having had a conversation with Golda Meir. She didn't admit at first it was Golda Meir. I think she wanted to keep it secret, but then the editors note this is a conversation with Golda Meir. And here's how the conversation plays out. She says as follows. She says, I want to tell you the conversation I had in Israel with a prominent political personality, Golda Meir, who was defending, in my opinion, disastrous non-separation of religion and state and evil in Israel, right? Arendt is critiquing the fact, this is already after the state, that there's no separation of church and state, right? We have the Rabbanut, we have religious law that is imposed as state law. What Golda Meir said, I'm not sure of the exact words anymore, ran something like this. She said, you will understand that as a socialist, I, of course, do not believe in God, right? So Golda Meir is saying, like, I don't believe in God, like this religious law is like whatever. But she says, I believe in the Jewish people. That's what Golda Meir says. Her emunah, her faith is in the Jewish people. Because as I said, right, secularism, nationalism, it puts the Jewish people at the center. And here's what Arendt says. Arendt is not a religious person, but she says something profoundly religious. She says, I found this a shocking statement. And being too shocked, I did not reply at the time. But I could have answered. This is what she's like, I should have said to Golda. We always think of our great answers, comebacks after the fact. This is what I should have told her. The greatness of this people was once that it believed in God. That was the greatness of the Jews, that we believed in God no matter what, and believed in him in such a way that its trust and love towards God was greater than its fear. That's how much the Jewish people love God. We're willing to love God more than we feared God. We're willing to do anything for God. And now, Arendt says, this people believes only in itself. What good can come out of that? Right, the greatness of the Jewish people was our faith and are willing to hold on to it, to make sacrifices for it no matter what, putting God at the center. Now we put ourselves at the center. And as Arendt notes, like, what does that mean for the Jews? If we're saying we are the ones who matter, we are the ones who decide, we are the ones who have to be powerful, we are the ones who have to act, it is about us. God, move it to the periphery, right? That's the dilemma that we're seeing here. And again, if you put yourself at the center, right, you are basically saying that the world existence revolves around you and your needs. And again, I want to be very clear, this is nothing special about Zionism here. This is what nationalism does. This has been a very long established critique of nationalism going back 150 years. Rav Amiel, in part, is driven by the events of World War I. World War I is an explosion of both imperialism and nationalism, the bloodiest war humanity had known up until that point. It leaves Rav Amiel traumatized. Rav Amiel is in Europe during it. And after that moment, right, he can't escape the dangers of nationalism. He knows what it is capable of. He knows how the nation can be put at the center. The nation can become God in a sense. And when the nation thinks itself as God, right, unfortunately, anything is fundamentally possible. Rav Amiel writes many times in his writings, he's very clear about this. He sees nationalism as potentially the renewal of ancient idolatry. I'll just read one particular statement of it here. He says, the form of ancient idolatry, right? What ancient idolatry used to be is the new modern nationalism. For within its depths, there are gods of the nations, right? Nationalism, by putting the nation at the center, treats each own nation as if it's a god. Every nation believes in its unique God, which is really an expression of the nation itself. And that God, right, the nation's own power, will save it from the hands of its enemies, who have their own gods, right? And wars are almost between nations, almost like wars between gods, right? You want to know whether the Jewish God is going to be triumphant, right, in the world? Well, if Israel beats Iran, then we know, right? Like that would be the kind of nationalist logic, right? It's a clash of civilizations that is also, that's the way we often use the language today, but 100 years ago, it was a clash of like religions. It was a clash of the gods, so to speak. That was what nationalist conflict was often seen to be like. And Rav Amiel is deeply, deeply, cognizant of that. Now, where does that take us? So Rav Amiel here is going to flesh out a little bit more, again, the dangers of what does it mean when the nation gets put at the center, when the nation almost becomes a godlike figure in the eyes of the nation. All right, here's what he says here. This is again from that same essay I was referencing before at the beginning. He says, nationalism in the way it is typically understood by other nations is rooted in the spirit of coarse narcissism that is found amongst all living things. There's a very classic critique of nationalism to the extent that even Rav Kook says it. Rav Kook says it repeatedly. Nationalism is inherently narcissistic. Why is nationalism inherently narcissistic? Because it puts the nation at the center. And if you think the world revolves around the nation, right, that's like the very definition of narcissism, right? Nationalism puts the nation at the center. It is a form of collective narcissism, right? The individual members of the nation can identify with the nation together. Its achievements are their achievements. Its glory is their glory, right? That's the way it thinks about itself. What Rav Amiel goes on to say, he says, is every living thing worries about its survival and fights a war for its survival, whether it is a defensive or an aggressive one. What he notes here is that nationalism is often tied up historically with ideas like social Darwinism, right? This notion that it's about nations competing to see who will be the strongest, right? The survival of the fittest, right? Like whoever has the biggest army, they're the ones who are going to win. They're the ones who are going to be around, right? They're the ones who are going to survive, right? Like that's the way that's the worldview that nationalism often depicts, that we have all these nations, they're all in fundamental conflict with each other. It's like, as Hobbes would say, the war of all against all, right? And the strongest is going to survive, right? That's the way it's often conceived of. He says, in place of the individual I that exists for all living things, with human beings, the social animal, there's also the collective I, right? I as part of this nation. I identify with the nation. Nationalism with the capital N is founded on the materialistic principle of the strongest will survive. And again, historically, it was often a racial sense, right? The nation was defined by a race. It was a superior race against an inferior race, one nation against another nation, right? Who will survive, right? You don't have to, if you know anything about Nazism, if you know anything about eugenics, like these things were rampant through 19th and early 20th century. He says here, it sees one who has the power is the one who determines what is just as good. It sees in the laws of nature and life only one ironclad rule: the bigger swallows up the smaller. That's just the way it is. Only the strongest survive, right? Strongest nation is the one that's going to make it. Therefore, the essence of nationalism rests on materialistic aggression, on the mighty hand and the great fist. Right? Nations go to war with each other because they know deep down that every nation is a threat to them and only the strongest is going to survive. Now, it's particularly striking here, I'll note, and it only occurred to me more recently, is the worldview that Rav Amiel is here depicting nationalism is very much the type of worldview that is often presented about the Middle East. Right? What is often said about the Middle East? Right? Like only the strongest make it here. Right? You have to show your enemies that if they hit you once, you'll hit them twice. Right? Israel will only survive in the Middle East if it shows everybody else that it can destroy them, that it can inflict horrible losses upon them. If it can show them that they're the strongest and therefore they're going to be here whether their enemies like it or not. Right? So the kind of worldview he's describing is not something from distant history. It's one that we see very much, playing out today as we think of ourselves as Zionists. So just look at Israel, where I live. This kind of discourse is all over the place. I mean, you cannot turn on the news, you cannot turn on social media without hearing people talk like this, right? Only the strongest are going to survive here, and we have to show our enemies what we're capable of, right? That's the kind of logic, that's the kind of language one hears all the time. And I'll even note here, he says that the logic of nationalism is the logic of the Egrof Hagadol, the Yad HaChazaka, the mighty fist, right? That's the symbol of nationalism. So I don't know if any of you are aware, but there is a political movement in Israel that has a symbol of a fist on it as its primary symbol on its flag. Does anybody know what it is? I'll ask. Right. So the political movement in Israel, what was that? Kach. Right. Kach. The party founded by Meir Kahane has the image of the fist on it. Right. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the head of Otzma Yehudit, Jewish power, which again, we should hear in that as English speakers like white power. It's the same idea essentially. Right. For Meir Kahane, right, his vision of Israel and Zionism, to the extent we can call him a Zionist, is one in which the Jews survive here because of their power. Right. And what's fascinating too, you have to keep in mind that image of the fist, right? That is Jewish power. That is the power of the Jewish people. We will show our enemies if they come to get us, this is what they're going to get. Of course, when you look at the Torah, whose fist is repeatedly described as being strong in the Torah, right? You've all been to Pesach Seders, right? The Yad HaChazaka is not the fist of the Jewish people, right? It is the hand of God, right? That is by which the Jewish people ultimately will survive and endure in this world. To say that it is our power and our fist, right, is a total inversion of that, a total and complete inversion of that. Rav Amiel continues, he says, this kind of nationalism does not draw its strength from the image of God that exists in a human being, but rather from the destroying devil that is found inside of him, from the hatred in him for all those who are not of his race or citizens of his land. Rav Amiel is very aware that nationalism often goes hand in hand with chauvinism, that to be a nationalist, a strong nationalist, means there are other people out there you hate. One of the things that Rav Amiel is very consistent about, he doesn't like how anti-Semitism makes Jews feel more like Jews or become Zionists. He thinks if you're going to be a Jew, it can't be because of anti-Semitism. If you're going to become a Zionist, it can't be because the Goyim are out to get us. You become a Jew or a Zionist because, again, as we said from the very beginning, you put God and Torah at the center, right? The moment you become a Jew or a Zionist because of the enemies, right, you're doing something else entirely here. And he goes on to say, he says, necessary to emphasize that our entire faith and the spirit of our Torah opposes this foreign species of nationalism from end to end. And not only this, but also our entire history shows that the nation of Israel did not exist and would be absolutely impossible to exist on such foundations, right? We can argue whether or not the Jews would survive without a nation state today, but the truth is they did. They did for 2,000 years. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fun. And the Holocaust obviously disrupted the very idea that could be something easier enduring, but it happened. And the Holocaust did not wipe us out, right? No matter how terrible it was, right? Jewish history shows there are alternatives to the nation state, even if most of us today may believe that the Jewish state is essential for the long-term health and vitality of the Jewish people. We've shown there are alternatives, right? It's not the only option, no matter what we want to think. What is particularly important here, I want to highlight for Rav Amiel, right? The sense in which the nation is at the center, the nation becomes God, right? The nation sees antagonists everywhere that have to be defeated. It is about the power of the nation, right? What this sets up is a very, very important problem, I would say, because if the nation is essentially deified, if the nation becomes God, right? You're worshiping God, but on a certain level, you're really worshiping yourself. That's what nationalism is kind of about. Then you are presented with a profound theological problem. And it's not just idolatry, right? What's the profound theological problem is that if the nation is God, then who are the only people that can be in the image of God, right? If the nation is God, then who are the only people that can be in the image of God? It's members of the nation, which means that when you are in a fully nationalistic mode, right, you cannot see that those outside the nation bear the image of God, because the only people that do are part of the nation, right? Those who are like us, because we are part of the divine, right? And I'll also note here, again, Rav Kook in many of his writings does make an explicit connection between that the Jews are themselves a manifestation of the divine, right? And you can see again how, in a certain sense, it has a lot in common with tendencies within romantic nationalism that Rav Amiel is ultimately describing here. Now, we don't have a ton of time left, so I want to make sure to just hammer home one very, very, very clear point about what this means, especially today. I will just note that the idea, again, that the world is full of nations that are out to get Israel, and therefore Jewish nationalism has to be stronger and be willing to fight them all back, was very much articulated by Vladimir Zhabotinsky as an essay here. I won't read it. Man is Wolf to Man, a very famous essay, where he basically says, like, we live in a world of wolves, right? You can't be a sheep. You're going to have power, and you're going to have to fight back. That is very much, again, part of the core Zionist ethos, exactly, unfortunately, as Rav Amiel described it. But here's another key point I want to make here. This is Ben Gurion, a quote from Ben Gurion in a Knesset debate. This is what Ben Gurion said. He says, there is nothing more important, more precious, and more sacred than the security of the state. If all the great ideals of the world are placed on one side of the scale and Israel's security on the other, I would choose without any hesitation the security of Israel. If I have to choose between the security of Israel and anything else, everything else goes, right? The Jewish people's safety and security are at the center, right? That is Ben Gurion's point here. Now, what is very striking is that this quote from Ben Gurion, which again fits with, again, Rav Amiel's idolatrous description of nationalism, this quote was used in a political ad maybe a year or two ago by Itamar Ben-Gvir. And again, head of Jewish power, follower of Meir Kahane, very much who embodies exactly all the worst things that Rav Amiel is describing here. In that particular political commercial, a series of quotes were played out, and each quote was said to be from Bet Gimel, right? With the assumption being that these are quotes from Bet Gimel is Itamar Ben-Gvir. And then at the end of the commercial, it showed all these quotes from Bet Gimel were actually from David Ben Gurion, right? And this was one of the quotes that they put out there, where maybe Ben Gurion means it in some sense that when we hear it from him, we don't bother us too much. But when Ben Gvir says it, he kind of brings out its real truth. What is it? If the Jewish people are what matter most, if the security of the Jewish people matter most, then everything else can be damned. Anything else can be sacrificed, because all that matters is that we're able to make it to tomorrow. Now, I will note that in the context of the war that has been playing out, right, this sensibility again has been everywhere, anywhere and everywhere. And it's been long noted that this isn't a problem that you often find expressed in religious Zionism, but it is at the heart of Zionism itself, that from the early days of the state, even people who were not religious, secular Zionists, would often take the state and the army and be very clear to frame it within religious language. Right, just one very brief example here. He said, this is from Charles Liebman, Ezra Dan Yechia's book on civil religion in Israel. He says, a huge banner carried by soldiers in a Haifa parade transformed the biblical phrase, Israel trusts the Lord, he is your help and defender, to Israel trusts the IDF, it is your help and defender. One newspaper published a photograph of 4 Israeli planes under the headline, the Guardian of Israel neither sleeps nor slumbers. Right, a biblical phrase in which the Guardian refers to God. A banner at an army base read, in the beginning, the IDF created the soldier and the IDF created the nation. Right, these are all examples from the 50s and 60s, very common in early days of secular Zionism. That kind of sensibility is all the more prominent the last several months. These are 2 examples. We don't have time to go into any great detail, but I'll just show them. The example on the right are soldiers reading Torah in Gaza. And this soldier who was reading Torah on a weekday morning, Monday or Thursday morning, instead of using a yad or just his hand, right, takes out a knife, right, a big serrated knife, right, and it made its way on social media. And again, the image is clear here to a certain extent, right, the sanctification of violence, right, the knife and the Torah. Now, what's striking is I knew a lot of people that were willing to defend this. They wanted to say what you see here isn't that bad. Even a good friend of mine who's a rabbi. And I think what was most striking to me was that my friend couldn't grasp one basic truth without even getting into the discussion whether this is idolatry, this is nationalism at its worst, may very well be those things. What my friend couldn't realize is that if you use a knife to read the Torah, what is there a high likelihood of happening to the Torah? Right? One of the things that you have to learn as a Baal Koreh, as a reader of the Torah, is that you have to be very careful with the yad, not to press it up too closely to the parchment, because you run the risk of damaging the Torah. You run the risk of actually scraping off one of the letters. If you use a knife like that to read the Torah, you're going to end up defacing and invalidating the Torah. Right? That is what happens when, again, violence becomes sanctified in that kind of way. Right? The example on the left here, this is from, I believe, Chabad, Believe in America. Right? You see the image again of the arm, the mighty arm, the fist, the muscle, wearing tefillin. And what does it say? I put on tefillin for Israel, right? Which is crazy because we don't put on tefillin for Israel. We put on tefillin for God. Yet here we're being said we're putting it on for Israel because, again, that's what matters most, right? And what is the association with the tefillin? It's not a mitzvah in some sense of kedusha or holiness, right? It's totally associated, identified here with strength, with might, right? Religion and might, religion and power, in both of these examples, religion and violence, are completely identified with each other. Now, to conclude, and I know, again, I'm opening up a lot of things, not able to fully unpack all of them, but I want to just, again, finish by playing out this critique a bit more fully, because Rav Amiel makes one more fundamental point about how we have to approach nationalism and the risk that it has when in turning to idolatry. In 1938, this is before the state of Israel, there was a major Arab revolt in the land of Israel. It already even started a little before then. But basically, Arab nationalism, Palestinian nationalism already emerged in the 20s. In 1929, there's a famous, very large Arab riot that kills over 100 Jews. By 1938, it's very clear to the Palestinians and the Jews that it's basically one side against the other. And once the British get out, the two of them are just going to go at it. And whoever wins, wins. And Palestinians are engaging in violence towards Jews. Jews are also engaging in violence towards Palestinians. You shoot the settlements in Israel. That's a fateful decision to make, right? When they are attacked by violence, what should be the Jewish community's response? Many voices in the Jewish community, particularly the revisionists, the Jabotinskyites, are arguing that if the Jews are attacked, right, the Jews have to retaliate. Doesn't matter if they retaliate against the people who did it. They have to retaliate even if it's killing innocents, because retaliation is the key to deterrence, right? That's their argument, right? It's an argument that you hear, again, all the time today, right? Retaliation is the key to a deterrence. Without it, you're one step closer to destruction. And again, what these arguments are being made, they're being framed as being for the good of the Jewish people, right? It's not like we're retaliating because we hate the Arabs, they all need to be exterminated. We're retaliating because if we do, that's how we preserve the Jewish people, right? We don't have a choice. We have to do it in order to save ourselves. That's the argument. Rav Amiel is profoundly disturbed about this because, again, it means putting the Jewish people at the center, and it means not being able to see in any way whatsoever, right, that the other, the one who is not a Jew, is created in the image of God. He says here, and this is his key point, in the end of the first paragraph, he says, even the second paragraph, he says, when it comes to the non-Jewish nations, they all agree that murder is wrong. But the truth is, when push comes to shove, they're willing to do whatever it takes for the good of the nation, right? We've seen that throughout history. We've seen it because they've done that to us, right? When push comes to shove, the nations will do whatever they want to us, even if on the other hand, they're proclaiming morality, proclaiming ethics. When push comes to shove, they'll do whatever they want to Jews, and they'll justify it however they want, right? As long as they feel it's necessary for themselves. They say that thou shalt not murder is one of the 10 commandments, but for them, survival is ultimately kola Torah kula. That's what Rav Amiel says when it comes to the other nations, right? He says that kind of thinking, he actually says it here, is the morality of the nationalism of Bismarck and Hitler, writing in 38. If you think anything and everything could be sacrificed for the nation, right? You know murder's wrong, but in this circumstance, it's allowed because it's for the nation. That's the kind of morality that you're engaging with, Bismarck and Hitler. It is a morality that is founded on the collective. It's only about what's good for us, and the ends always justify the means. For the good of the collective, one can use even the most despicable means. However, Jewish morality teaches the opposite. A mitzvah done through sin is not a mitzvah, right? The stones of the altar are profaned if a blade is pressed up against it. And I'll make one final point here. Rav Amiel actually goes on to note that it says in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and it's also possible in the Rambam, that there are circumstances, as much as self-defense permits us to do what is necessary to survive, there are circumstances where there has to be limits, right? He says here, Jewish morality teaches that even the interests of the collective, of thousands and 10,000s, does not permit murder, the murder of the individual. But even indirect murder is not permitted, despite the fact the individual may be lost anyway. If the non-Jews say, give us Plony or we kill all of you, all Jews should die, and one should not give up one Jewish life. Our Torah does not begin with the history of the Jewish people, rather with the history of humanity from Adam Arishon. Our final goal is not only to have a majority of Jews in the land of Israel, but rather the goal, the end of days, is to fix the world. The commandment of thou shalt not kill is a manifestation of the holiness of the divine image in human beings. The ultimate essence of Judaism is that human beings are created in the image of God. Being able to recognize that you cannot murder, that killing innocents is the worst thing a human being can do, right? That is the message of the Torah. That is its fundamental message. He says, if God forbid, this plague of spilling innocent blood out of revenge, which I don't believe has happened, but he knows it's possible. There's no healing from this by whispering restraint. Instead, the evil must be eliminated at its root to uproot the nationalism of non-Jews. The nationalism of the non-Jews sees the mitzvah of you shall live by the sword as extremely important, right? Nationalism basically will sacrifice anybody and everybody for the nation, right? That's the way it works. That's the way it's God. It's at the center. That's the way it works. That kind of thinking means you will live by the sword, which is the way the Torah describes Esav, which is again, meant to be the exact opposite of how the Jewish people are supposed to be in the world. So I want to end on a slightly pessimistic note, but I think it's still important to raise this. This banner, which has Am Yisrael Chai on it, is located outside my son's school here in Baka, South Jerusalem, fairly open, modern community. I'm sure there are these Am Yisrael Chai banners outside most schools in this country. I happened to take this picture yesterday because I was walking by and I noticed somebody added 2 words after Am Yisrael Chai. Right? If you look closely, what does it say? It says Am Yisrael Chai al Charvo. Right? The Jewish people live by the sword. Right? The al Charvo is specifically a reference to what I read before regarding Esav. Right? This is essentially the whole encapsulation of everything I'm describing right now. Nationalism assumes that the nation is at the center and the nation will survive. It will survive by its own power, by its own violence that it's willing to mete out towards others. Somebody put this here. I don't know. I might have been critique. I'm guessing it was probably more of an affirmation. Rav Amiel actually goes on to say, and it's because it's this week's parsha, I'll end with this. Right? It says in this week's parsha, we received the prohibition of murder, right? That you cannot kill a human being because a human being is created in the image of God. And Rav Amiel notes is that the fundamental act of faith is being able to recognize that. If you murder somebody who is innocent, it essentially means you cannot be a believing person, because to be a believing person, a person of faith, means being able to see that the other is created in the image of God. And Rav Amiel notes, he writes a year later, that even despite the fact that for the most part, the yeshiva has taken on a policy of restraint, it's not going to go just retaliate blindly, it's going to be restrained. There are still Jews, he notes, who are murdering innocents. And again, for him, the very idea that our nation can be built on that means that that kind of nation will be rotten to its core. Now, again, this is a broad critique. I recognize there's a lot of elements that this raises, but the point that I want to end with is very simple, right? To be a Jew means ultimately putting God and the Torah at the center. It means that not anything and everything can be done for our own safety and security. And when I see even very religious rabbis talking as if all that matters is the Jewish people's power, all that matters is our needs, all that matters is that we are able to sacrifice whatever it takes and anybody that it takes in order to be here, that could not be farther from a religious position than anyone could possibly ever articulate. And the challenge is recognizing nationalism's excesses, particularly in a time of war, particularly in a time of perceived existential war, and consistently asking ourselves, again, what are the limits? What does it mean to try to put God and Torah and ultimately the other was created in the image of God at the center rather than just ourselves? I'll end here, and I know we don't have a ton of time, but I'm not.
Okay, Rav Zach, thank you for this very challenging and thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to start with by reading a few questions in the chat. I'm also going to ask my colleague Isaac to monitor the live stream on Facebook to send any questions that come from there. And then if y'all have questions, you can raise your Zoom hand as well. So I'm going to read all three of these at once, Zach, just because you can also see them in the chat.
Sure.
One comes from Janet. She asks, how were Rav Amiel's views about this received in his time? Were they ever accepted? It seems to me that now they would be thoroughly dismissed, although I suspect many American Jews would be completely on board. Rabbi Eli writes, in Israel, are people saying they're fighting out of revenge or out of protection? Pamela writes, my other question, and there's a previous one if you want to see that too. Do you think that the orthodoxy that controls religious life in Israel is really practicing nationalism and not putting God in the center, as you say? Also from Rabbi Michael here, I don't hear anyone in the Israeli political system articulating this critique. Is that accurate? All right, so that's a whole bunch, and more to come. I see Rav Chaim has a hand up too, which we'll come to after
let me
this.
say a couple of things. This critique here is not meant to be like, again, it's easy if you just direct this critique at religious Zionism, if you direct it at religious Zionism's excesses as embodied in figures like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. But the problem that Rav Amiel is laying out here is nationalism writ large. What makes religious Zionism more dangerous is that it is easier for it to basically enlist religious language in being able to justify the worst possible things, right? That's the danger with religion always, is that you can use it to justify the worst. And one of the things that was very striking to me earlier on in the beginning of the war is that the voices that were consistently most critical, even within the army, about not going too far in response to what had occurred, were consistently secular voices. And the religious voices, religious captains, generals in the army who wear knitted kippot like religious Zionists, were often the ones articulating the most violent responses as necessary for October 7th. And I personally found that a little shocking and kind of important to take back. Why are the most ethical positions coming from those who we typically associate as being least religious? And a large part of that has to do with the way, again, religion can be so harnessed by nationalism in a way that is simply not, like I would say, what God wants. I don't know how else to put it that way. There's another question that's raised here about deterrence and revenge. This is a very important question, and it gets to the way in which nationalism's excesses are not often conscious. I don't think people that put the nation at the center see themselves engaging in an act of idolatry. God forbid, right? They see themselves as loving the Jewish people, right? The Jewish people are of great and maybe even ultimate significance for them. What has happened, though, in the context after October 7th, and this is true, I think, with Israel's in a historical sense, is that Israel historically has a difficult time describing or discerning the difference between deterrence and revenge. in part because there is a sense in the Middle East that the way you get deterrence is by engaging in revenge. Right? If deterrence is about specifically stopping the enemy from being able to hurt you again, or taking action that makes clear to the enemy that they're not going to be like physically able to do it, right? Like deterrence is going to look different than revenge. Revenge is often about humiliation. It's often about like destroying objects, buildings of symbolic importance. It's about making people suffer, right? Deterrence is ultimately about preventing the enemy from being able to hurt you again. It means often going after their military, capacities, right? Much of what you've seen, for example, in the war in Lebanon, it very much fits the description of deterrence. They're going after missiles. They're going after the beepers. We're going after terrorists, right? These are clear efforts at going after those who can hurt, Israel. In Gaza, where the destruction has been far more wholesale, right? There's a sense that I often feel, and again, this has been validated in videos and statements by many soldiers who have been there, right? That they don't think about it so much in terms of deterrence. They think about it much more in terms of revenge. And there may be even people who are making decisions for the army, for the government, who are thinking that they are doing deterrence, but they also may be thinking that the only way to do deterrence is to by engaging in acts that are really revenge. So that is a very difficult problem that very much concerns me. I'm not a military strategist. I never served in the army. I don't claim to have expertise in these things. At the same time, it's clear to me that the line between deterrence and revenge is a profoundly important one. And it feels like, at least in Gaza, that line has many times been erased, explicitly by at least some soldiers. They admit to it. There was a eulogy at a funeral last week here. It was all over the news, in which the family members and friends were giving great eulogies about how their friend had gone to Gaza to engage in revenge, to burn it down, right? Like that attitude is very much present. That soldier happened to be religious, but there are plenty of soldiers who bear that attitude who aren't, religious. And again, I'm not besmirching the thousands and thousands of people who have made great sacrifices. I was at a funeral for an Israeli soldier this week for 3 hours at our Herzl, son-in-law of a former teacher, lives in my neighborhood. I used to see him and his kids around all the time. Right, there are profound sacrifices being made, but at the same time, right, like as Shmuley said in his introduction, right? You see things, you can't unsee them, and there are things that need to be said. Was there another question? I know there was a hand raised before.
Yes, just before we go to Rav Chaim's hand raise, I'm also going to throw in the mix what Rabbi Spitzer wrote over here on the side. I'm wondering how Amiel stayed a Zionist and did not end up where Tamaris ended up, whose religious pacifism led him to reject nationalism. So you can think about that. And Rav Chaim, if you want to articulate your question.
Well, let me just respond to that first.
Okay. Okay, great.
Which is that it's a good question, right? Rav Amiel is not a pacifist. Pacifism is a very complicated word. I'm not a pacifist, right? What happens is, as I've discovered, is the moment you start talking about placing limits on military action in the context of war, suddenly the label pacifist gets thrown out immediately, right? Like the Gemara says, somebody comes to kill you, you have to kill them first. I believe that with every fiber of my being. It's why I'm a Zionist to a large extent. What Rav Amiel is not denigrating is violence, right? In sake of self-defense. What he is saying is that there have to be limits. And he is very aware how easy those limits can disappear. Rav Tamrat was very much more of a pacifist, didn't believe in violence at all. Rav Amiel perhaps has the fantasy that states have on some level the ability to limit the violence they engage in self-defense. That may be a fantasy. I can talk for hours on that point, right? But he is still striving to try to put the line, hold the line there. Part of the reason why he may be able to stay a Zionist, and we just don't know this, is he dies before the state of Israel. He never sees the War of Independence. He doesn't see what happened in the War of Independence. He doesn't see, Palestinian cities of Israel being placed under military occupation in Israel. Keep in mind, he doesn't see any of that. I don't know whether that would have changed his perspective or not. Yishai Leibovitz was actually a little less critical before the War of Independence and became more critical over time. With Rav Amiel, I don't know, but everything he says here, and this is what continuously inspires and shocks me, is how much the realities you're describing are completely applicable to the reality that we live in today, right? And in some sense, because there is no state, because the whole weight of the Jewish people isn't being held by a state, he's actually able to say these things. And they need to be heard. Again, I'm not a pacifist. The question here is, how can we prevent nationalism from erasing the image of God that the other, who is not part of our nation, bears? And that is the fundamental challenge that he's struggling with here. Rav Chaim?
Yes. So thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's a breath of fresh air and really important, vital. I'll make my points quickly. Number one, you talked about the secular response. There's a secular tradition. Achad Ha'am wrote very, very passionately about bloodshed. And we need to acquaint ourselves with that as well. And I think to bring together both Achad Ha'am's thinking with Rav Amiel's thinking, it's a very fruitful, I think, merger of someone coming from a secular point of view, but very Jewish, and someone who's engaged with Jewish teaching and understands the principle that you're after. I want to get to that in a moment, because I have a question. You said that about religion being harnessed by nationalism. I think that nationalism is being harnessed by religion, the other way around. In other words, that the religious leadership is using nationalism to assert its own sense of power. In other words, I don't trust them in terms of really what it's about. Tzvi Yehuda wrote that we are a fighting people. When I read that, I said, who taught him that? Where did he learn that we're a fighting people? Where does that come from, that idea? And Rabbi Meir wrote a tshuva that using the knife as a yad is appropriate. So in other words, we see how the religion is corrupted. And I think that's really was it corrupted by nationalism? Was it, or somehow did religion seek this need because of the absence of religious power over the centuries, and all of a sudden this opportunity arose. So there's a dual movement. I wouldn't reject the idea that nationalism is using religion, but religion is also using nationalism. And the last thing I want to say is I think the main point that we want to make here, and that you have made, is that Rav Amiel is stressing, and why he can remain a Zionist is he believes that religion has a function as a control over nationalism. So and that's something that we don't know. I mean, right? It's the opposite of what we've seen.
Right. So I'll go in reverse order here. Classically, right, that was the role of the prophet, right? The prophet's role is to speak truth to power, to function as a check on the excessive power of the king, right? We see that throughout Tanakh, right? If religion is to play a prophetic function within Zionism, it cannot be fully conflated. There can't be an equal sign between Judaism and Zionism. Otherwise, there's no possibility of that, right? So that's part of where we have to be able to recapture on a certain level, is the sense they are not fundamentally one and the same. Everything that is good for the state is not necessarily good for the Jews. That's just something we have to, accept. With regards to, again, nationalism harnessing religion, religion harnessing nationalism, which you have to, I'm strongly a believer that it's nationalism harnessing religion, in large part because nationalism emerges as a response to modern secularism, right? As God empties out from the world, right, one of the ways we find an alternative is through nationalism. The nation takes on a transcendent status because we experience the nation in a transcendent way. It feels like the nation's been around forever. It's bigger than me. It's more than me. It makes demands on me. My children will live on through it, right? The nation becomes a substitute for God writ large in European, as in the process of European secularization. Nationalism becomes a replacement for religion, which is an argument that Rav Amiel basically himself makes, right? The similarities, but I mean, again, without really unpacking this, if you look at the history of romantic nationalism in Europe, particularly in Germany, right, like you see this playing out very, very clearly, and Zionism very much goes in that particular, in that particular mode. The question, again, in terms of recovering, what does it mean to have faith, is, again, we always have to ask ourselves, are there times where we're going to be asked to do things that are against our own self-interest, against our own collective self-interest of Jews? If we can't find those things, if everything can be just used to ultimately justify our own needs, then it's just simply not a religious position, right? And in a time of war, everybody gets drafted in a time of war, right? And including the Torah, right? And at that point, then anything can be commanded and used for our own, needs. One of the things that's been so painful is I think there have been American Jews who've wanted to raise, again, critique alternative perspectives, but the immediate response from Israel is simply, you're not here, you're not suffering, how dare you? And there's a truth to that, I get that. On the other hand, like, the temptation to silence all critique is just ever present. I bring this up with people, the immediate response I get is, well, you're a utopian, right? You're a pacifist. I'm like, no, I just see excesses taking place that we should all be concerned about. I see things being justified exactly in the manner Rav Amiel describes. They're not in the image of God, right? We can sacrifice whoever we need to kill, right? If we got to kill one terrorist, you can kill 100, right? You want to level Gaza, you can do that, right? Like, that's what's demanded of us. That's what we need. I mean, you hear that almost, ever present. I don't think people, again, trauma does very difficult things to people. It's very difficult to have a critical self-awareness in the context of this. But again, I think the voices still need to be, raised and heard. And if you bring even, again, just the need for some level of limits, and the immediate response is you're a pacifist, you're a utopian, you just want to have a clean conscience, you can't deal with the realities of the world. Anytime you hear those things, it's essentially a defensive reaction about not wanting to deal with the critique, right? Because there's always what to be critiqued. We're Jews, we should know this. And even while following the news with the war the last year, there's more than a little that needs to be critiqued or can be critiqued or should be at least subject to a conversation. You also mentioned—
Okay, Rav Zach, I'm going to ask you one last question if you have time.
Sure.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so I see
I want to hear the other.
Rabbi Bria
Just about
Kahana.
Achad Ha'am,
Yes.
Rav Amiel was very influenced by Achad Ha'am. He
Yes.
relates to his writings consistently. He likes Achad Ha'am. He doesn't like Achad Ha'am because he's not religious, right?
Right.
Like, Achad Ha'am has done the secular move. He replaces the nation. It's the spiritual, ethical dimension of the nation, but he still puts that at the center more than God and Torah, and that's his problem. But yeah, what Achad Ha'am and Rav Amiel both have is they don't have fantasies about Zionism. They know that it's going to have problems. They don't have a messianic attitude that it's going to solve everything. And most Zionists, Herzl at the forefront as a secular Jew, and anybody who was religious, saw Zionism as a revolutionary and redemptive moment that would change everything for the Jews. And if that's the case, then it can't be subject to critique. What makes Achad Ha'am and Rav Amiel different is they know there are problems, and there will be problems.
But they also have a sense of the
ethical
center of Judaism. In other words, Achad Ha'am also understands Torah as the ethical dimension of Torah. I mean, he talks about that.
Correct.
So I don't think we can divorce him from the Jewish tradition in that way. He's secular, but he's very Jewish, and to that extent, there's a good opportunity to forge a type of a relationship, of a coalition with people who think along these ways. It's not simply a religious issue. It's a Zionist issue that you're talking about.
Correct. Again, where Zionism and Judaism can't be separated is that even its secular form, Zionism is always, drawing directly on Judaism. So there's no way around that. Last question from Rav Shmuley.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, I see there's one here from Rabbi Bria Kahana. The Tanakh criticizes the kings, but it emphasizes the land and Jewish connection to it. If it's not nationalism, what is the connection to the land and sovereignty on it? Duty, obligation.
So that's a bigger question than I can answer in 30 seconds. It's an important question. I mean, the simple way to describe it is that modern sovereignty, especially in Israel, is conditioned on the notion that the land belongs to us. It's our physical possession. It's an object that we own, right? You own your house, we own the land. That's modern nationalism. That's the way modern sovereignty conceives of its relationships with the land. Anybody who's familiar with the Torah and has learned Sefer Vayikra knows that God is very clear to the Jewish people. Who owns the land, right? It's God, not the Jewish people, right? And there are consequences of that. The fact that Jewish people don't own the land, they don't have this organic, romantic relationship to the land. It's not an extension of who we are, right? We were here once. First off, the Jewish people did not emerge as a nation in the land of Israel, despite what the Declaration of Independence says. The Jewish people emerged as a nation in exile in Egypt, right? And the Torah was given in Sinai, in the desert. When it comes to the land, we have a conditional relationship to it. That's what the Torah says. We have a brit, and the Torah is very clear. Right? Of all the sins that get you kicked out of the land of Israel, what's at the top of that list is murder, right? The spilling of innocent blood. Right. So all of that immediately fundamentally complicates, right, modern notions of sovereignty, as if we have total ownership, total control of the land, and everybody else be damned.
Rav Zach, thank you so much for this very thoughtful presentation. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I know the recordings will be up later today and out tomorrow, because a number of people wanted to join who last minute couldn't, or if you want to share with others, and we'll have more opportunities to learn with Rav Zach and other classes. Our next class is next week about our allyship with Native American communities. Rosetta Walker, who's an elder in a Native community, is going to be talking with us. next week if you'd like to join us. Have a wonderful day or night. Thank you so much. Cool, too.